Here's what's coming up on episode 35 of the Big Séance podcast. Cemetery Confessions. I mean, as soon as you figure it out that you're not listening to a podcast about cemeteries, it automatically takes you to an element that you have to figure out about the Goth culture.
And I think Goth culture is very sort of introspective and really about those quiet moments and about thinking about your life and others' lives and where you're going and how you fit into this long walk to the grave. And I think the cemetery is a great place for that.
The thing about Goth culture is that they don't look at death and dying in the same way that mainstream culture does.
I think a large majority of Goths are interested in the paranormal or the spiritual realm. And, you know, there is no religion associated with Goth, but a lot of Goths are into sort of the more, I guess, esoteric would be the word, religions. Things dealing with the spiritual, the unknowable, the mysterious.
And isn't there something a little goth about being obsessed with talking to the dead?
Oh, absolutely.
I'm working to get my at least temporary goth card. And so that's one point for that card for me right there, spirit communication.
You can paint one fingernail black.
That's one more point. Yeah.
And I loved Halloween as a kid. And even before my gothy days, I loved like the mystique during that time. It was really magical for me.
Have you had any paranormal experiences?
Just 2 days ago, I was home. I was in the basement. My wife was upstairs exercising. She comes downstairs.
Here we go.
She comes downstairs and she says, "Hey, I just saw a ghost." We can guess and think about it and write books about it, but it really is this sort of beautiful secret. And when someone passes on, you know, now they know.
What do you feel are some of the biggest misconceptions of what goth is?
Welcome to the Big Séance podcast. I'm Patrick Keller of BigSeance.com, and this is a place for an open discussion on all things paranormal, but specifically topics like ghosts and hauntings, paranormal research, spirit communication, psychics and mediums, and life after death. So basically, anything that pops up in my paranormal world. The candles are already lit, so you might as well come on in and join the séance.
Welcome, fellow paranerds, to another episode of the Big Séance podcast. I just got home a few days ago from a vacation I took with my mother through parts of the South, where we visited the beautiful Natchez, Mississippi, saw the famously haunted King's Tavern there, even though they were randomly closed. We stayed at the also famously haunted Myrtle's Plantation in St. Francisville, Louisiana, visited some beautiful historic homes and plantations, and then stayed a couple of days in New Orleans, where I was able to walk around and take a selfie at the famously haunted LaLaurie Mansion. It was a big trip. I visited 3 different cemeteries along the way to do some photography, and I came back with an overwhelming 900 plus photos. I've been sharing those photos as I go through and edit them on the Big Séance Facebook page, if you're interested, and they'll all eventually be up there and on my Flickr page as well. You will be hearing more about this trip in the future, obviously. But one thing that was on my mind while I was there was the interview I recorded just before I left. I could not wait to get back to edit it and get it into your hands, or maybe into your ears. So without further ado, here is one of the more interesting interviews I've ever had. And I promise you're going to want to listen to this one. It might not be what you think, though. I want you to meet the Count and Mark, the 2 incredibly kind and intelligent hosts from the Cemetery Confessions podcast, a podcast about the Goth community and Goth issues. I'm one of their newest fans, and I wanted to talk to them about the crossover between the paranormal and the goth subcultures. Do you think we share some nerdy traits? Do you consider yourself a member of the goth community? Well, if you're not, and I'm kind of assuming most of you aren't, prepare to learn a little. It's fascinating. Here we go. Well, ladies and gentlemen and paranerds from all over the world, today I have some special guests, and I think it'll be an episode and an interview like none we've had before. Several months ago, I noticed a podcast was nominated for an award for the 10th Annual Podcast Awards. The podcast was called Cemetery Confessions, and I was like, shut up, what? I've never heard of such a podcast, and I love cemeteries. I'll be checking this out, thank you. And after checking it out, I quickly learned that the podcast wasn't exactly what I thought it was going to be. But somehow, I've been a regular listener ever since. According to their website, the Cemetery Confessions podcast discusses news related to the goth community. They go in depth with sociological and psychological goth topics. They review music and movies. They also state, and I'm going to read right from the site now, while there is an overabundance of industrial goth music web shows, there is a glaring lack of goth talk podcasts, none to be exact. We desire to fill that void with spooky goodness. Our mission is to further expand, build, and commiserate with the goth community on an international level. So I'm listening to this show, and though I'm not goth, I'm learning so much about the goth subculture, and I find it fascinating. Well, I contacted the Count and Mark, the incredibly well-spoken and intellectual co-hosts of this podcast, and I told them I just knew that there had to be some fascinating similarities and experiences that are shared among both the paranormal and goth subcultures. And so they agreed to come on the show. Hey, gentlemen, welcome to the Big Séance podcast.
Hello, thank you for having us on.
Good to be here.
Cool. Do you want to introduce yourselves? You both have very distinct voices, but I'm sure it would help the listeners to hear who you are from the very beginning.
Sure. I guess I'll go first. I'm the Count. I am the host of Cemetery Confessions and also the Requiem podcast, which is a music show I've been doing for about 8 years. Started Cemetery Confessions about a year ago, simply because I wanted to put some more academic tinged information out there about the goth subculture and about subcultures relating to sociology in general. And yeah, I've been doing that ever since and trying to grow the show. And we just launched a podcast network actually called the Belfry, where we bring together several other darkly inclined podcasts, I suppose. And yeah, just trying to analyze and inform the general public about sort of subcultures that don't really get a lot of positive coverage in the media.
None to be exact.
Yeah.
Well, you guys tend to get very intellectual, I will say that.
We try to. We have no formal training, but we pretend we do. So.
We use a lot of big words, and we sound confident while using those big words.
That seems to work.
So as to convey an air of intelligence, when really we have none at all.
And right now you're listening to Mark, the other co-host of the show.
Yeah, I guess I should talk about myself. I'm Mark, a.k.a. DJ Gomez. I've been interested in goth culture, I guess, for like 13 years, probably around that. I started DJing gothic music starting in 2007 on our college radio station. My show was called The Catacombs. And after I graduated, I kept the show going in various formats. I was on a low-powered community station in Cincinnati for a while, and then I took it online, and it's kind of been online ever since then in various forms. But I started co-hosting Cemetery Confessions with the Counts, I think starting last year, quite a few months ago. But yeah, for me, it's mainly a lot of music, DJing, but I'm always, like I said, I'm fascinated with the goth culture, and I'm always willing to talk about it and express my opinions, which probably don't have any merit 98% of the time, but still, I enjoy hearing the sound of my own voice, so here's to you.
I am so excited to have you both on, I promise you. So, the name, let's start here. The name, Cemetery Confessions, explain that to us, because clearly I missed that from the very beginning.
Yeah, so, I guess there were some unintended consequences of calling the show that, which I didn't really think through. Before I launched the show, there's really not a very interesting story there. I was just trying to find something that conveyed either darkness or macabre element that was also catchy and memorable. And there was sort of a nice alliteration to the phrase, and it seemed to encapsulate that ambiance and ethereal beauty that the goth culture tends to enjoy. And I mean, also, while it's not about cemeteries specifically, we do try to talk about them because personally, I know you said that you love cemeteries, and I also do. I really think they're underappreciated. They have such a history and a beauty to them. There's like this dichotomy of joy and melancholy that you get, and sorrow when you go to them. It's that realization of inevitable mortality, which I think is really inherent to goth culture, that is really sort of missing from mainstream culture, which I love. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, there's such beautiful statues.
Whoa, way off topic.
Yeah. That's, let's keep personal matters, personal. Yeah. There's like this incredible, the more I learn about cemeteries, the more I love them. There's the symbolism to a lot of the tombstones and mausoleums that you'll see that you don't necessarily understand unless you know it. And yeah, I just think the cemetery is sort of a quintessential element of goth culture, sort of next to, you'll hear the term darkness thrown out a lot. And yeah, so I think that's partially a good representation of the essence of the goth lifestyle, I suppose.
Well, I think that works. I mean, as soon as you figure it out that you're not listening to a podcast about cemeteries, it automatically takes you to an element that you have to figure out about the goth culture.
Yeah, a lot of goths like to spend time in cemeteries. I mean, it really is. And if you frequent them, there is a stillness and like this quiet reflection that doesn't exist in normal culture when it's so bombarded with everybody doing things. If you have a spare second, you're on your phone, you're on Facebook, doing whatever. And I think goth culture is very sort of introspective and really about those quiet moments and about thinking about your life and others' lives and where you're going and how you fit into this long walk to the grave. And I think the cemetery is a great place for that.
I've said this a few times on the podcast, but I remember even before I was, knew I was going to be such a big paranormal nerd, my grandma, I remember a few times packing a lunch for me, and I would go to the, in the middle of nowhere old cemetery near her house and just hang out with my lunch, just like it was the park. And so they've always been that way to me. Like there's nothing not beautiful about it.
Yeah, I agree. Actually, my wife and I take my son to the cemetery occasionally. There's actually a really nice one by us that has a park across the street. And occasionally we'll have picnics and things. And yeah, I mean, you'll see people just at the most raw, some of the most raw and open moments of their life. And that's another thing that I think you don't see often. People are very guarded about their emotions and about the reality of life. And you just see people in these sort of pure moments. And it's really this great reminder of, what am I doing here? Why am I here? What's the purpose of it all?
And keep in mind that before modern medicine, people were, I guess, much less reticent about death and their own mortality. Like people used to go into cemeteries and have picnics so they could spend time with their loved ones who've passed on.
Right.
So I think in today's culture, there's such an attitude and just a wary nature about death and dying. You know, people try to avoid it. They struggle coming to grips with it, and they just try to push it out of their minds and perceive it as this big, dark, ominous demon coming for you in the future, when really it doesn't have to be that way. And the thing about goth culture is that they don't look at death and dying in the same way that mainstream culture does. So the going to the cemeteries and visiting the sites of people who've passed on, I think that's kind of like an after effect of the attitude in Goths toward death.
Yeah, just to quickly add on to that, you know, less than 100 years ago, people were keeping dead loved ones in their home for several days and then burying them themselves and making, you know, memento mori out of hair or, you know, possessions of those that have passed on. And now everything's so clinical. You never even,
right.
You know, after someone dies, you never even really have to see them again. And I think that has sort of caused a lot of psychological issues because nobody knows how to mourn anymore. And
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
It's popped up from time to time on the podcast, but it's a topic that I have wanted to get into more and, you know, have an episode just on death and dying, you know, and how over the years we've changed and how we grieve and process that stuff. It's
really fascinating. Yeah.
So let's jump in with the big question, and this could make or break the entire episode.
Oh God.
The pressure. But what do we think? Are there similarities? Do we share audience members that are cursed with the flair for both goth and the paranormal?
I think there's a lot of crossover.
Yes.
Yeah, we I guess I'll jump in here. We actually had an episode where we did talk about the paranormal, and in my personal life, I do know I think a large majority of goths are interested in the paranormal or the spiritual realm. And, you know, there is no religion associated with goth, but a lot of goths are into sort of the more, I guess, esoteric would be the word, religions, things dealing with the spiritual, the unknowable, the mysterious. I think both subcultures, because I was thinking about this, and I think both subcultures are made up of people who are at once rational and appreciative of science and skeptical, but also know that there are things that science can't answer. There is a realm beyond, or at the very least, I guess we could say that science has yet to answer. But I think they're able to rectify those two things, and I think that's fantastic because a lot of, you know, there's sort of a stereotype about the paranormal subculture of people just believing anything is a ghost and seeing ghosts everywhere. But a lot of the, at least investigators I have met, have been very much going into it with a skeptical mind, often trying to disprove the paranormal rather than, you know, chalk things up to ghosts or spirits or demons or whatever, just to say, hey, there's a spiritual realm. And I think that's fantastic. So when you look at goth, the subculture came out of a music movement and an aesthetic back in the very early 80s. But since then, it has sort of enveloped a more of a lifestyle element to it, more of a depth of meaning than just music and just aesthetic. And I have a, if you don't mind, I have a 5-point sort of explanation for that lifestyle that I think you'll see a lot of crossover between the two subcultures in. So the first one is a social departure from the mainstream. That's pretty typical of any subculture. The second is an aspect of morbidity and appreciation for an expression of the macabre. The third is the embracing of darkness. The fourth is a sense of mystery, madness, and the arcane. And then the fifth is an active pursuit of making those part of one's daily life. So, you know, obviously not all of those apply to the paranormal subculture, but I do think that some of those they have in spades. And I think that's why you see so often goths are attracted to the paranormal and are even become amateur ghost. I'm not sure what the correct term is. I don't want to offend anyone, but inspectors, hunters. I'm not sure.
Many titles could work for that.
No, well, I don't think they like that.
I tend to use paranormal investigator as the term.
Yes, that's the word I was looking for. But yeah, so I do think there's a lot of crossover in both ideology and just the members of the two.
Well, probably the biggest part of what gets me so excited about the paranormal, and I know many listeners would agree because we cover it a lot here, but it's spirit communication. And so I love researching and experimenting with the different tools and techniques. And isn't there something a little goth about being obsessed with talking to the dead?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And not in a, a lot of times in the mainstream, you'll see people doing it like with the Charlie phenomenon, people doing that just to simply scare themselves. But there's actual like inquisitiveness and curiosity and sort of scientific thirst for knowledge there that I think both share.
So I'll tell the audience, I guess, before we started this interview, I told the Count and Mark that I'm working to get my at least temporary goth card. And so that's one point for that card for me right there, spirit communication. There's one right there.
Yeah, well, you have another 572 to go. Actually, I'm sorry, 665 to go. Let's make it a little more goth there.
Oh, man, I got to keep working on it.
You can paint one fingernail black.
That's one more point. Yeah.
Well, for me,
I would ask what you're wearing, but that might be a little too creepy.
Well, I will tell you,
it's a little statutory.
I've seen some of your style that you like to wear, sir, and I am a t-shirt and gym shorts kind of guy, and tend to wear the
you've
same.
Just lost one of your goth friends. I'm sorry.
I tend to wear the same 7 shirts, one for each day of the week, and just wash them, and then grab them and put them on again. So, man, I guess I'm negative now.
Do you have the days of the month on your underwear as well?
I do not.
Okay.
Do not. Well, other than this spirit communication, I can tell you that until I listened to your podcast, I had a probably very not accurate at all, view of the goth subculture. But fall and Halloween is like my favorite time of the year. And to me, the atmosphere and that I try to create for myself, even if it's just me sitting here chilling in my office, or, the candles and the Victorian themes and the colors. It's almost like I want to be a little goth around those times, even if I'm not chilling out in a cemetery with some cool outfit.
Well, you're in good company. I think that is, I know that is the favorite season and holiday of the goth community. And I don't know, maybe we can make you an honorary goth for the month. Maybe we can meet in the middle there. But yeah, for me, my wife and my son, who is 2.5 now, we've actually had sort of a family tradition for a while where, and I probably have you beat here, but starting the first weekend in September, each weekend preceding that, we go out to do something spooky. So either,
I love it.
Haunted house, or I've actually look up sort of what are said to be haunted areas nearby, cemeteries or buildings or things like that, and go explore. Nothing formal. And then the day after Halloween, we get up early, do all of our half-price shopping, and we can decorate our house for the rest of the year.
Absolutely.
That's a bonus of Halloween.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't think, I don't think Halloween is inherently goth. There's a lot of, goths love horror and sort of the cheese that comes along with the season, which, they sort of ironically enjoy. But there's a lot of elegance and atmosphere, as you mentioned, to the season. And I think it's beautiful. I think there's something in the air.
It's also a time that goth culture is a little more accepted in mainstream circles.
Yeah. Well, okay, so here's my chance to get another point, perhaps.
Okay.
So,
I'm keeping tally for the Goth Council. I'll let them know.
That's
by
good.
the end of the show.
Maybe this will be a bigger point. We'll see. Or maybe 2 points, worth 2. 2 years ago, 2 Halloweens ago, I started what for me at the time was an unusual tradition, but I was fascinated with it, of creating a Halloween altar. And a similar altar, I forget what they call it, but I like in the pagan culture, I think they have an altar or something. They call it's not a Halloween altar, but some kind of altar.
The pagan holiday was Samhain,
right? But didn't they have some kind of, I don't know, I'll have to look that up because I've forgotten it, because it's kind of what inspired it. But so I have lots of pictures online, but I think I stepped it up the second year. But I just put anything. I wanted to kind of go for like a Victorian spooky
I like it
feel, and every night I just wanted to like cut the power to the house and just light candles.
Light some candles. Oh yeah.
And just take myself back into like turn of the century. And I think last year I put some just spooky pictures, old pictures I found online, or like old pictures of kids trick-or-treating. And I found these really gaudy, cheap black candelabras that I just loved. and I've actually, and here's where I'm going for another point, I've actually gotten myself to keep those candelabras out around the house throughout the year when it's even not Halloween.
I think so. I'll have to confirm with the council, but I think we can give you 3 points on that.
Yes.
Yeah, this is generally all year round, but we actually keep electric candles around the house. So during the night when we have to go places, I prefer to use those simply because it's a nice atmosphere. But yeah, I guess my entire house would be a Halloween altar. But I don't know, Mark. Do you have any Halloween traditions or?
Well, I guess I'm a little less intense than you. I don't spend all of September doing spooky things. For me, it's mainly the month of October.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to deduct some Goth points from you, Mark.
This was all just for the purpose of having a competition. You realize that, right?
I'm tenured, sorry.
You're right, good point.
But yeah, well, I was fortunate because my birthday falls in October, so even as a kid, I loved the month of October, and I loved Halloween as a kid, and even before my gothy days, I loved like the mystique during that time. I remember I still have images in my head of when I was maybe 5 years old and just outside swinging in the fall weather and just the sound of the leaves and the colors. It was really magical for me, and it was important enough that it stuck in my mind, and I'm talking about it all these years later. But yeah, in more recent years, I definitely I like to go out during that month for more practical purposes, just because the weather's nice, and I'm not a person who really likes hot weather. And
or the large yellow hurdy thing in the sky. We don't like that.
Yeah, and
I would concur with that.
Yeah, and I'm also not really a big fan of Father Winter either, so fall is great for me. So
yeah, for
I'm
me,
always out.
Just sort of a short anecdote. I actually grew up in a very conservative Christian family, and so we never got to celebrate Halloween, which is incredibly depressing for me. But just this last October, my wife and I took my son out to trick-or-treat, and that was the first time I had ever trick-or-treated in my entire life, and I could not wipe the smile off my face for a week. It was such it sounds stupid to people who have been doing it their entire lives, but it was such a magical experience to me, just finally getting to properly celebrate the holiday I've loved for so long. Share that with my son.
That seriously bummed me out just hearing you say that.
It was horrific.
Wow. But that's cool. No, I totally get that.
And then get fat off candy. So that was great.
Yeah, I've never been able to maintain any kind of diet around the Halloween. No. For some people, it's Christmas and Thanksgiving. It starts with Halloween for me.
Yeah, as soon as the displays at Target go up for the candy, I'm like, well, I guess I'm getting bags of candy this week again.
The first bag of candy corn I see, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah, one year I ate one of those big bags of Skittles and I threw up in 7 different colors.
Yeah.
That is awesome. And how old were you when you did that?
No Goth points awarded.
That was last year, no. I can't even remember.
So I know our listeners are probably wondering this, and I know that they would get a kick out of this. And I guess we've heard a little bit of this, but are either of you into the paranormal, and have you had any paranormal experiences?
Well, I've always been intrigued by it. For me, though, this is my opinion. I'm no expert, but I think that some people are just more open to it. I guess their minds are more sensitive to it. I don't know if it's like a genetic trait or if it's something that can be learned. But for me personally, I've never had an experience, and it's always bummed me out because I have a lot of friends who are really sensitive to it. And, you know, they've told me stories, and I'm like...
What kind of stories, Mark?
Well, if you don't interrupt me, I'll tell you.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
I was telling the Count before we started about a friend of mine who had an experience with shadow people. He was out. I think he was playing like tag at night. It was some kind of like church retreat, and he encountered a shadow person coming toward him, and he described it as a huge silhouette with really long limbs, very tall creature, but it was human in shape, and it was just coming toward him slowly, and the person he was playing tag with saw him just standing there looking in this direction, so he walked up, and he's like, "Hey man, what's going on?" And he looked in that direction, and he saw it too. So, you know, it wasn't just my friend seeing it. You know, you had 2 people seeing this giant figure coming toward them, and obviously they just ran off in the opposite direction. But, you know, that's... I told the Count that my friend tends to embellish stories, but you know, just from what all the details that he described to me, I have a hard time believing that he was making this up.
Yeah,
it wasn't vague by any stretch. It was very detailed. He recounted to me the emotions that he was feeling at the time. So, you know, I think it is something that certain people are just sensitive to, but unfortunately, I'm not. I've never had an experience.
That's okay. I tended to, until I started getting into all of this stuff and researching and really coming out as a paranormal nerd, like I guess 7 or 8 years ago, I didn't have a lot of experiences growing up either. It's only been, you know, in the past few years, really. So for me, it's always been about searching out those experiences and being jealous of others that have had them.
Yeah.
So for me, and maybe we can talk a bit about religion and their view of the paranormal. But as I mentioned, being brought up in a conservative Christian family, I was taught any of those paranormal or ghost sightings were demonic. It was some sort of demonic activity trying to convince people that there was something other than something to life after death other than heaven or hell. And you know, since then, I've actually gone on to, still being a Christian today, I've actually gone on to do a little bit of research into that. And there's actually most of the claims from Christianity about Bible verses that they'll throw out about once you die, your spirit goes either to heaven or hell. A lot of those are, the verses themselves are very ambiguous, and you have to make a lot of assumption to imply that. And there are actually, having talked to a few people, priests and people of the Christian faith, that absolutely believe there are ghosts, that there are spirits, that there are potentially echoes or residue or energy left over from someone after they pass. So at this point in my life, and this has happened to me in about the last year as I've gone on this I've been purging all of these horrible things that were forced onto me in my childhood. So, you know, that's sort of a journey I've had. So I went from being believing all of that was either a lie or demonic to having a completely different opinion. It's actually interesting that we're recording the podcast now because the strangeness of the timing, just 2 days ago, I was home. I was in the basement. My wife was upstairs exercising. She comes downstairs.
Here we go.
She comes downstairs, and I'm playing a video game or something, so I turn it off to go talk to her. And she says, "Hey, I just saw a ghost." And I kind of laughed because I thought it was a joke. And she got upset. She said, "No, I'm not kidding. I saw a ghost." So she was getting ready to exercise. The door to the bedroom was closed. She had one light on. So the room was dim. It was daytime, so the room was dim, but she could clearly see everything. She said she got onto the exercise machine, turned her music on. She heard a noise that sounded like something at the door. She looked over, and she saw a black shadow. It was about slightly taller than me, so probably like 5'9", head, like from where its head was to the floor. She could see the outline of the door and the shoe rack and everything behind it, but the actual figure was completely black. She couldn't see through it. And she said it looked more like sort of a male figure. So initially she thought it was me, like I had come into the room. So she looked down at her iPod to turn her music off and then looked back up and it wasn't there anymore and the door was still closed. And she, at that time she texted me and said, "Hey, did you just come upstairs?" And I said, "No, I didn't think anything of it." So yeah, and that was her experience, and that's the first paranormal experience I've ever had. It was just completely out of the blue. I don't think they've ever experienced anything like that here that I've heard of because I live with her parents. And yeah, I was like, okay, so had you been exercising? Were you sitting on the floor and you just stood up? Was the room really dark? Were you maybe like turning around real fast or something? And, she was completely, I went through all these like, okay, what could it possibly have been biologically other than a ghost? But she was just completely normal and lucid and everything. And it was just insane to me. And then I was like, oh, hey, well, I'm doing a paranormal podcast, so I can tell this story.
It was all just preparing you for this moment.
Yeah, they knew. Whoever it was knew. But yeah, it just completely blew my mind because when I was a kid, I suppose there were times when I heard sounds or I maybe saw things out of the corner of my eye. And just because of my upbringing, I always thought, well, it's one of these things or I would just start praying or something. So I never really gave it much thought until recently. But yeah, that was just absolutely crazy experience for me.
Yeah, I had those, looking back, you had those experiences as a child where it was really no big deal. And then now as an adult, you look back and you're like, wow, that's was that paranormal? Or, is this, did I have an imaginary friend? Or,
yeah.
And, when you're so into the paranormal, sometimes it's like, am I trying to make this more than it is? Or
right. And I think, perhaps to my detriment, I don't know. I tend to swing the other way where I think of every other possible thing it could be and then write it off to something. Well, I was a kid or I was half asleep or,
right.
But there's no, either way, there's no way to know, I guess, or prove. But, like I said, I absolutely think that there could be ghosts, life after death, energy left over, any of those sorts of things. I just haven't had much experience in it.
Well, it's funny because the checklist that you just went down after that experience is something that a paranormal investigator goes through all the time or yeah. should be, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's probably what you should do, but then celebrate it if you can't figure it out.
Yeah,
yay! There's a possibility yeah. This could have been paranormal.
Yes. Yeah, I was curious about how you feel about this because there has been some, as I've been casually looking into it, I have come across theories that sort of relate to theoretical physics. Theories about possible crossover or I don't know what the terms are, shadows between dimensions, things to do with time disruptions that can cause, all these. Theoretical physics is theoretical, but also incredibly complex. But there are these sort of scientific theories for those things, crossing between worlds, dimensions, time and space, things like that. Do you have thoughts about that? Do you put any stock in that? Has it crossed your path at all?
Well, what I can tell you is that I started this whole paranormal craze about the same time that I went through an obsession with books. And I grew up absolutely hating to read and didn't ever read unless someone forced me, and sometimes not even then.
Yeah.
And, you know, it was like 10 years ago when someone convinced me just to read this book out of a long series of fiction. And all of a sudden it clicked. And so it started with fiction, and I read for a whole year. It was like one book a week. And I was so impressed with myself that I was reading so much and enjoying it that I couldn't stop. Well, after that first year of reading books, it very quickly shifted into purely nonfiction books about paranormal, spiritual topics. And, you know, the first couple of books that I read that kind of got into that and life on the other side and ghosts, and I started to think, wow, this is cool. This is how it really is. And since then, you know, I've talked to numerous psychics and mediums and have friends now who are psychics and mediums, and other books from scientists, or when they're talking about quantum physics and time dimensions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And every one will sometimes be a little different. And sometimes you'll talk to one person who says, well, when I communicate with spirit, this is how it goes. But then the next week you'll talk to someone who says something completely opposite, which for a while frustrated me, because I wanted to have an answer. I wanted to say, okay, this is what I can expect. This is what, this is how it works. This is how the crossing over moment works. This is, you know, once I cross over, I can come back and speak to my loved ones. You know, or do you have an option of which realm you go to? Or am I placed here? Or do I imagine something and I'm immediately taken there? So I don't necessarily have a theory anymore. I try to be, I guess it's taught me to be open, because I used to tell people, oh, no, you're wrong.
Right.
You know, and that's silly.
Everybody loves to do that, though.
Yeah. I mean, in the paranormal, there's only, you know, 500,000 explanations for why something happened. And so it's taught me to be very, you know, I might have my opinions about it, and I do get skeptical about things, but it's taught me to be more open and just kind of listen to, I think everybody kind of has different experiences, especially with psychics and mediums. But I will say that I tend to probably follow this theory, at least as it pertains to crossing over, that you kind of create whatever you expect is just kind of created for you. I think that sounds like the most interesting theory for me right now.
Right. I can see that. That's something I hadn't considered, was the fact that there isn't necessarily a linear through line between all of it. That could be, you know, if there was sort of the science fiction sort of explanation for it, it would be a lot more consistent.
Well, if you think about it, people live very different lives here in this realm, and no one person's life experience is exactly the same. So, you know, why should everything be completely linear and uniform in the next realm? Right.
Sylvia Browne, who a lot of people have issues with, and I might be skeptical about some things from Sylvia Browne, but, you know, she passed away, I think last year she passed away, but she has, you know, tons of books about life on the other side. And she was one of the first books that I read, and I was very skeptical reading it. You know, when you just see her, she just looks like, you know, a crazy psychic that's always on Montel Williams or whatever. And you're just like, what? And, but my mom actually convinced me to read the first Sylvia Browne book. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. And I really kind of resonated with a lot of what she had to say about, you know, what life was like on the other side, what it looked like, the experiences that you could have, what you could create as your life on the other side when you got over there or whatever. And so that's always stuck with me. You know, sometimes I hope that it's like that. But like I said, I've read lots of different interpretations of that since then.
We had a guest on our show once who was talking to us. It was an episode about death, and she was talking about the afterlife and how she was brought up. And she said something that I sort of thought was really beautiful is that, you know, we can guess and come up with these conjectures about what the afterlife is, what happens, but the way her parents taught her when she was very little was they said whenever someone would die, they would say, now they know the secret. And I thought that was just sort of this beautiful, you know, we can guess and think about it and write books about it, but it really is this sort of beautiful secret. And when someone passes on, you know, now they know.
Well, one thing I can tell you from being involved in the paranormal now and doing, reading all the books and doing a little bit of research, even though it's still one giant question mark, I don't fear it. And I know I don't fear death, I guess I should say. And I do have friends that do fear death. And I don't know if that's something if it's a religious thing that's kind of instilled in them or what it is. But
I think that's sort of part of mainstream culture. I mean, as we sort of touched on it earlier, I think that the acceptance of death and the knowledge of death and the coming face to face with that really can help us live fuller lives, because not only do we realize this is the time we have to make the best of it, but also we can just treat people better, because it doesn't matter what your social status is. It doesn't matter what your disabilities are. We're all, you know, there's the French play, The Danse Macabre, and it's about how king and pauper, it doesn't matter. We all are united and equal in the grave. And I think that acceptance is something that's really important. And I don't know if you've heard of the Order of the Good Death, but that's a death positive society. It's run by a mortician trying to spread the reality of death and that we can accept it and through that live fuller lives. And I think that's something that the Goth community has really tried to embrace.
Yeah, and you can't cheat death. People try to do all these things to live longer and, you know, extend their lives for as long as humanly possible. And I'm not saying, you know, you should just eat junk food and, you know, never exercise and, you know, smoke yourself to oblivion just because, you know, you're going to die. Everybody's going to die. What does it matter? I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it shouldn't be feared, because it's something that everyone is going to meet one day regardless. And, you know, whether you're afraid of it or not, it's not going to change anything. So why be afraid?
Yeah, even if you look at, you know, I don't know if either of you are familiar with futurists, but, you know, the idea that at some point technology will catch up to a place where we can live forever, or at least vastly increase our lifespan. That technology, even like at the most optimistic, is way past our lifetime. So I think if you spend your life thinking that you can cheat death or you can have your brain transferred into a computer and live on past that, you know, your death and life is not necessarily binary even that way. You know, there's more to a person than just their higher brain functions. And so I think it is something that society as a whole should take a look at in their own life, how death affects them and how they're going to choose to live their lives.
Absolutely.
Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I was curious in your opinion on the Ouija board, because I have had, like I said, I have had a lot of friends who have had paranormal experiences, and usually negative experiences with the Ouija board. So to my understanding, it's like a gate, and when you open it up, you don't know what you're going to get from the other side, whether it's something hostile or not hostile. You know, it's just kind of a gamble. I mean, that's just what I understand about it, but I've never used one, and like I said, I've never had any kind of experience, but my friends have told me some horror stories, so I was just curious what your take was on that.
I have always felt that the Ouija board is just a tool like any of the other tools, you know, that I would use or a paranormal investigator would use, or even not even if it's a physical tool, but just any kind of technique. Like I've carried on communication with the spirit just through knocks in the wall, you know, so that it's not always a tool. But I think that that's just something that our culture has kind of figured out since The Exorcist, you know, when that started and kind of gave it a bad name. I've learned a lot from Karen A. Dahlman, who's become a good friend of mine, who's an absolute genius and expert on the Ouija board and has books out about that. And, I've just learned to not fear it, and I don't approach the Ouija board with fear. And, I'll do like a meditation or some silence or a prayer before any kind of spirit communication usually. But even though I feel that, and that's my opinion, I have to tell you that I've had zero experiences at all with the Ouija board. And that kind of bums me out. The closest thing I have gotten to an experience with the Ouija board, I usually record and have other meters around and things if I'm having a Ouija session. And I did get a response through the spirit box. Do you guys know what the spirit box is?
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't get a lot of responses from the spirit box either, usually. And so I asked if they could tell me what it was that I was touching. And, my hand was on the planchette of the Ouija board. And very clearly, and I've played this on a recent podcast, but very clearly you heard Ouija board through the spirit box. And that's the coolest Ouija experience I've had, but it didn't come through the Ouija board.
See, and I've seen, I've heard both. I've heard differing sides. On the one hand, I have friends who are into either Wicca or, magic or things of that nature that are very serious about the Ouija board and have very specific rules you need to follow, that it's something you need to respect and bad things can happen, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the other hand, I don't know if you're familiar, there's a show, Penn and Teller do a show called Bull, and they did an episode on the Ouija board.
I haven't seen that.
Essentially debunking it. Now, their sample size was very small, but, they demonstrated how the mind of the users can influence, what's happening. And they went through some experiments and things. So I've seen both sides of it. So I don't personally know where I stand because, again, growing up in a religious family, that was a very big no-no.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, it's fascinating. Both sides of it are fascinating.
A lot of people have that growing up experience of, that one night we were at so-and-so's house and we got the Ouija board out. Yeah. Or we were having this frat party and we decided to get the Ouija board out. And I didn't have that experience growing up to kind of shape an idea about the Ouija board. I'd only started using the Ouija board probably like 5 years ago. So... But
I mean, probably for the best, because in those situations, it's more group excitement, adrenaline,
and you never
hysteria.
Know. I mean, who can you trust when you get 10 people together and you're drinking and I wouldn't have trusted some of those people back then anyway. We'll be right back with the Count and Mark. I promise.
You're listening to the Big Séance podcast with Patrick Keller. Look for us on iTunes and be sure to check out bigseance.com for more discussion.
Today, I want to take a special time out to give a shout out to Diane and Denise, the hilarious hosts of the History Goes Bump podcast. Their podcast is one giant ghost tour for the theater of the mind, as they like to say. I'm a new fan of this podcast as well. Incidentally, they've invited me to be a guest on their show, which sounds totally fun to me. So if that happens, I'll definitely keep you posted. And actually, these two ladies seem like a perfect fit to be guests on the Big Séance podcast as well, don't they? We just might have to arrange that. Anyway, Diane and Denise gave us a 5-star rating and a very kind review in iTunes. Thank you, ladies. And listeners, go check out their show, the History Goes Bump podcast. If you'd like to learn how you can help to promote and share all things Big Séance podcast, visit bigseance.com and click on Contact in the main menu. Now back to the Count and Mark, the co-hosts of the Cemetery Confessions podcast.
Thanks for joining us for the Big Séance podcast. We'd better get back to the table while there's still some candlelight left.
As just about everyone knows, I'm a middle school teacher, and really, I think one of the other reasons I enjoy learning from your show, Cemetery Confessions, is that I know that I have had students who identify as Goth, even if I don't realize it. I'm very big on acceptance and equality and understanding differences and promoting that. And I know that probably most of my audience is hearing Goth talk right now for maybe the first time. So let's clear some things up. What do you feel are some of the biggest misconceptions of what Goth is?
Well, I would like to point out, you mentioned, having students who identified as that. I would like to say, having been on that side of it, I think if you find that your child is into Goth or some sort of strange subculture, of course, as a parent, you want to be cautious of them doing anything that could harm themselves. But, the Goth subculture specifically is very much about artistic expression. And yes, there are darker themes, but it is very harmless. It's really an expression of, a lot of people get into it seeing a mainstream culture that is very whitewashed and very happy and very fake, and feeling inside themselves that, I'm not always happy. I'm not always glad to see you in the morning, when I'm at school and I'm tired and I'm grumpy and I'm supposed to pretend to like you when I really don't like you. And I think that expression of emotion is very good. And I think that creative outlet is very healthy. And as a parent, like my parents tried to do, if you try to squash that to just fit them into some sort of culturally acceptable mold, that's not going to help anyone. They're going to do it behind your back. They're going to resent you. So love your kids, have an open communication with them. Don't be judgmental about it, because they'll stop sharing things with you. Of course, protect them, but you want to be very careful about how you treat them, because that's how you get people going off doing drugs at other people's houses, or, not related to the Goth subculture, but just kids in general. If you tell them not to do something and are rude about it, they're going to go do it for sure.
Mm-hmm. And could I add that it's also natural for like kids that age and teenagers to explore different identities, to try on different hats.
Absolutely.
And society, it seems, especially the school system, they love to suppress that. I think that a lot of them just want kids to, dress this way and only do this and this, and just, kind of force them into that herd mentality. And I don't think that's healthy. It's not healthy for the creative mind. It's not healthy for a person's sense of identity and individuality. And, I think that whether it's goth or punk or, whatever the kids are doing these days, whatever subculture it is, it should be encouraged and allowed, because, and
within reason, of course, you know,
right. If you're
you don't want your kids,
I'm sorry,
in a warehouse doing heroin for a week or something.
Right.
But I think, growing up, every goth pretty much heard from their parents they were in a phase and they were going to get over it. And I think, Mark, to your point, talking about experimentation, a lot of people do get into goth as just a rebellion against their parents, or as just wanting to try something out and be different, and then they grow out of it. But what I think a lot of people don't know is what you see now, the subculture being nearly 40 years old. You have people I know people in their 50s and over that are part of the goth subculture, that have kids, that have their own kids, that have stable jobs and houses, and that's just how they identify and express themselves. So, if you're really concerned, take comfort in the fact that it could just be a phase, but don't tell your kids that, because then they'll want to make it not a phase. I think another common misconception, obviously, and to me, this is just so comical because it's not at all true, but the conception that goths are Satanists, it can, I suppose, be confusing from an outside perspective, seeing perhaps occasionally occult symbols, people who are goths that are Satanists. But first, there's a few misconceptions there. There's the right-wing perception of what Satanism is, which is, animal sacrifice, killing people, things like that, which is really not the case. You have, if you look at LaVeyan Satanism or the Church of Satan, things like that, it's very, very different. But also, the point I really want to make is that Goth, as I said before, has no religion. You have Goths that are Christians. You have Goths that are atheist, Satanist, anything. You can name anything. You have Satanists who are lawyers, businessmen, doctors, dentists. So
Presidents.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the culture that Goth wants to change. When we were talking about cemeteries, there's a stigma. And there's this stigma in, I think, our culture about things that are dark being bad. And I think as a person, we all have a range of emotions and a range of ways that we express ourselves. And no one is always happy. No one is always sad. No one, through colors, you don't always express yourself as a bright, golden, glowing color. Sometimes you're melancholy. And I think that's part of the culture that the subculture tries to expose. And that's scary for some people. So it's easier for them to write off what they don't understand. For example, the conservative Christians writing off paranormal as demonic. It's easier to write it off in your mind as something evil that you don't understand, so you don't have to deal with it, so you don't have to be challenged by it. And I think that's dangerous.
I find it fascinating thinking about, like you were saying, different generations now that have been in the goth subculture from the time it started. I think that is, and I have to say, I've not seen large numbers of students that I would consider probably identifying with goth. I have seen them. I don't think there's a lot of it, at least in my little world around here. But there are times when I just assumed that goth wasn't a thing anymore, and then all of a sudden I listen to your podcast and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's huge, and it's still here. And I never thought about different parents, goth parents with goth kids. I was like, that is so cool.
Yeah, it is, it's a subculture. It's a very small subculture. It's very niche. If you look at the largest goth festival in the world is in Germany, and they get about 30,000 people that show up. So if you extrapolate that to, everyone who obviously can't pay to travel to Germany, it's still, in comparison, a very small portion of the population. But they are around, and there's new young people getting interested in it. There's people who have been in it forever. I know a guy who is in his 40s who just a few years ago discovered goth for the first time and felt that sort of thing that most goths feel when they discover that acceptance and homecoming and finally understanding themselves, and became, got into the culture that way. So yeah, it's definitely around.
So the last question I kind of want to explore here is something I'm excited to get your answers. My listeners and my students know that I'm all about promoting being a nerd at as many different things as possible.
Yes.
And nerding out on those things with pride. So do you have areas of nerdiness outside of what you would consider to be goth?
Who wants to go first?
Mark, you can. I talked a lot. You can go ahead. I have a lot to say about nerd culture, so
all right.
Go ahead, jump in.
Well, first and foremost, I am a Whovian. I am a major Doctor Who fan, and whenever the Count was talking about, quantum physics or whatever he was...
Quantum entanglement, spooky action at a distance.
All I was thinking was wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey. So, Doctor Who is a big thing for me. I actually have a tattoo of a weeping angel on my left shoulder. So yeah, it's very, very important to me. I'm also a huge Twin Peaks fan, which is another kind of a cult show. I like a lot of cult television
and it's totally
shows.
coming back, right?
Oh yeah, they're making a third season. Yeah.
God, what else? I like Firefly. I like Buffy. I like, all the Joss Whedon stuff and other stuff, I'm sure. But yeah, huge nerd here.
Yeah, there is, just to speak to that, there is a huge portion of goth culture that are nerds in the pop culture sense, which that whole culture is interesting in itself because, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was very much similar to goth where you were picked on, ostracized, made fun of just for being intellectual and into sort of heady ideas and things. And then now you've seen in the mainstream, obviously, the explosion of nerd culture being the kind of hip thing, which I think is definitely fascinating. But yeah, for me, and I think a lot of goths, I'm very into that nerd pop culture, I suppose. I'm very into video games and film. I'm sort of a film nerd. I love learning about film production and the art of filmmaking. I'm into, sci-fi and fantasy. I love fantasy. And yeah, I love Doctor Who. I'm not as big of a Doctor Who fan, but all those sort of sci-fi TV shows that you hear nerds talk about at conventions all the time, I'm into all that. So yeah, C2E2, Comic-Con, be there. Yeah, I love comic books, all that kind of stuff. I actually, for a little while, I considered making a nerd podcast, but there's so many of those out there that I thought it was a bit oversaturated. But yeah, there's a huge crossover there. And I think that's going back to one of the very first questions, any sort of subculture or minority. I think it's important to remember that we have all felt that sense of ostracization and what it's like to be looked down upon and to be set apart in a bad way from everyone else just for who you are, or just for wanting to explore something deeper than the sort of vapid mainstream culture. And I think that sort of through line is something that connects all of us and something that we can, relate to in another person and go from there. It doesn't matter what subculture you're in. We've all sort of been there. And I think that's really a kind of beautiful human experience that we should keep in the back of our minds.
And it's so interesting because with all of the nerdy areas you both talked about, I know very little about all of those nerdy areas. So maybe you do need to start several more podcasts so I could learn about Doctor Who and all of that stuff. And, for video games, the last video game I mastered was Dr. Mario or something like
that's a
that.
Classic,
so
yeah.
I'd be really lost if I tried to nerd out on that.
Yeah.
So I want you both to plug your show and give us all that information. But first, I have to tell you that you do a wonderful job with the podcast. You guys are fun to listen to, but this is no goofball podcast either. I mean, as of the time of this recording, your most recent episode discusses the topic of mental illness, for God's sake. Yeah. So you put a lot of hard work into it, and it's a great resource for anyone wanting to educate themselves. So promote away, plug the show here.
That really means a lot. Occasionally I get emails from people that are not part of the goth subculture that are just get into the show because of the academic approach we try to take and the human level to it. And that's always just really the highest compliment because it's content created for goths. But when people are able to find a connection there, it really means a lot. So yeah, I would just plug the Belfry.RIP. That's the web extension there. Pretty awesome.
That's awesome.
That's home to all of the podcasts that are part of the network, including Cemetery Confessions. And we post articles up there. I've written a few sort of sociology-based diatribes or theses, I guess you could say. So yeah, you can find pretty much everything that I have there, all my shows. Mark, if you want to, I know you have a separate DJ show and whatnot.
Well, I'd like to double plug the Belfry.RIP. Not only will you get links to all different kinds of podcasts, all of them relating at least loosely to dark culture. Like, for example, there's like a horror movie podcast. There's a second goth talk podcast, which is more anthropology based. It's called Gothropology.
There's a radio drama, a few other things. We're working on getting some other shows on there, but yeah.
Yeah, but you can read there are blogs that I've written, that the Count has written. Just a lot of really cool content on that network. I guess I should also mention there is the Requiem.net, which you can also find on the Belfry, but that is all the music. The Count and I both DJ, and we will put mixes on there. There are a lot of other DJs that contribute to that as well. So if you're into gothic and industrial music, definitely...
Or want to discover it, see if you like it or not.
Yeah, go to the Belfry and look up the Requiem, because that is your hub for music.
Awesome. I have to tell you, this is probably one of the more fascinating interviews that I've had, and I can talk to you guys all night long.
Oh, I'm sure you say that to all your guests.
Well, I always tell my guests that they rock, but truly, I mean, it's been very, very cool to talk with you.
Thank you. That
We
means a lot.
could have had a 5-part podcast.
Yeah, I feel it's only been an hour. I feel like there's another 4 hours to go. I don't know what to do with myself.
You're just getting warmed up.
Yeah, this is oh man, this has been so much fun. I love the format. I love talking with you. It's been a lot of fun.
For show notes, including links to anything we may have mentioned in this episode, visit bigseance.com, now the home of both the blog and the podcast. Just click on the Big Seance Podcast logo or find it in the menu. You can also find and subscribe to the show on iTunes and Stitcher. Do you have any comments or feedback? Please contact me at patrick@bigseance.com. You can call my feedback line at 7755-TELL-ME. That's 775-583-5563. You can also record audio feedback right from the site using the SpeakPipe link included in the show notes. I could decide to include your voice in a future show. Thank you so much for listening and reading. Unfortunately, it's time to blow the candles out, but we'll see you and light them again next time.
Episode in part 2.
We'll have some outtakes,
There
some
you go.
Easter eggs,
There's one
Easter
right
eggs.
Outtake number 1.
Outtake.
Yep.